the internal colonial concept. So obviously there's a number of things happening. There's a settler colonialism, there's colonialism, and there's internal colonialism. Settler colonialism is being argued to be one group goes to another place and looks to eliminate the existing population. Colonialism traditionally is one group stays where they are, but rules another group from afar, and becomes the metropole, or the home country, the mother country, so to speak. And again, as I conceive it, white America comprises the motherland, or the metropole, and Black America, however it shows up dispersed throughout the country, is paying homage, obeisance, fealty, literal material resource to that mother country. The internal colonial concept, for me, argues that is the internalizing of that colonial idea. So that's why I'm saying that I do compare Black America to white America in the way I do find parallel between that relationship and the relationship of a traditional colonial, maybe not settler colonial, but colonial experience. That is, one group living distinctly from another and dominating them from afar. Long story short, and I even wrote a summarizing note here because I figured that by the time I got here, it'd be going long. But the long story short here with this Hind article is that first of all, I thought it was fascinating. I loved. I feel like I read it a long time. I know the name, but maybe whatever. But the review or the return was great. Okay, so oh wow, I skipped my notes here. So the New York Times article I started with: Schuessler wants to politely and liberally dismiss the shortcomings of internal colonialism theory. That's what I think was the goal of the initial, and to make the point that Israel's not really, Zionism is not colonialism, and settler colonialism as an idea should be, if not fully dismissed, it should not be applied to the United States or to Israel, or it should be it's a little more complicated than that. Veracini wants more nuanced study of these various colonialisms, hence settler colonialism studies. Hind, I've said here, maybe providing the distinctions and forms of colonialism that perhaps Kiyanga Yamada Taylor was coming from, that may be informing her criticisms. And that I might be overdoing it here, or it might just be that this article is over my head, but I think the article ignores the political purposes behind the use of internal colonialism theory in Black liberation struggles. So when it offers, I think, an interesting criticism of internal colonialism, or it introduces readers to the idea, some of the history, and some of what the criticisms are, it doesn't really show those criticisms to be valuable or correct, and it doesn't, for me, show why it would be wrong for, or why the internal colonialism theory as it's been applied to Black liberation has been insufficient. And then the article doesn't really say what would be the preferred theorization then. So if not internal colonialism, what's better? Are you arguing then that this general approach to pluralism is better, whatever, that America's a democracy is better? All right. But the use of internal colonial theories to examine racial developments within the United States of America has become almost fashionable by the late 1960s. A decade later, a study of political economy of Wales described the internal colonial approach, which it criticized as a new variant of a time-worn model. So what this article is doing, published in 1984, it covers a lot of different approaches to the concept. It's not just talking about my variant, or how Black America has applied the variant, a variant of the theory. But as Ferdinand Broad said, no theory, no history. So any general history always requires an overall model, good or bad, against which it can be interpreted. I think I generally agree with that. diverse forms. So there is, as it says here, the Trotskyite form of internal colonialism, uh, saying that Stalin's forced collectivization was thus Trotskyism applied within a framework of internal colonialism. As was said here, Lenin depicts the migration of small industrialists and handcraftsmen from the central, long settled, and economically advantaged regions of Tsarist Russia to the steppes as manifestation of the colonization of outer regions. So, like for my classes, what would want for my students to get from this is an introduction to this way of thinking, an introduction to some of the broader world histories that are referenced here, and then the way that Black people here in the United States have, as I've always appreciated the theoretical approach, returned themselves to the world stage of history, as Dr. Clark might have said at one point, uh, by saying not the same, it has distinct features. We have distinct issues and histories to deal with, but we are a group of humans too. And when the world is in consideration of uprise and reorganization and rebellion, we're in the mix too. Um, as Hind talks about here, again, people have conceived the colonial relationship as occurring between the bourgeois north of Italy and the southern Italy and islands surrounding Italy reduced to colonies, the South African issue of Africans colonized within Southern Africa. I noted here I would like to read this article at some point. Stalinism, a study of internal colonialism. Um, there's Stalinism in this thesis, internal colonialism is the use of state power by one section of society to impose unfavorable rates of exchange upon another. In the 1930s, the internal colonial image was used to characterize relations between the northern and southern parts of the United States. More recently, however, the imagery has become identified with inquiries into the experience of specific racial or ethnic minorities. I remember reading years ago Baran and Sweezy's book. What was the name of their book? But they wrote collectively wrote a book, White Communists, and they said that they said the American Civil War was a, 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 a colonial conquest, the northern industrial colonial metropole conquering its colonies, and the neo-colonial elites that had the plantocracy that had arisen there. Um, Eldridge Cleaver considered themselves elsewhere in the United States. Individuals such as Eldridge Cleaver considered themselves as stolen people held in a colonial status on a stolen land. While administration of the ghettos by outsiders is also depicted as an essential feature of conventional colonialism, other aspects of the experience of Black people are seen to differ from the classic colonial model. Within the country, they constitute a minority. They are less autonomous. They are more dispersed, and and the group culture and social structure of the colonized is less developed. So maybe this is in part where Taylor finds or others find their uh some distinction again with the talking about, and again, Charles Penderhughes said the same thing in our discussion about it. Again, Black people are more dispersed, less autonomous, and simply constitute a minority, and therefore should be seen as he would say internal colonies. Maybe others would say that this is why they shouldn't be seen as internally colonized at all. Um, my point has always been these are distinctions, these are differences with little distinction. And more importantly is the relationship that Black people have, which is again, wherever you find Black people in this society, their relationship to society is meant to be one of exploitation, extraction, symbolic abuse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The thesis that relations between white and black people in America are essentially those of colonizer and colonized contends that all of the former acquire or believe that they acquire some privileges and advantages from the relationship. However, it does not claim that the relationship developed by methods that were identical to those of conventional colonialism. For instance, the lengthy period during which the slave trade and slavery existed and the allegedly deliberate mixture of slaves from different tribes and regions to facilitate white control constituted a cultural attack upon black languages, customs, and traditions of black people in America of a severity not experienced by indigenous people in African colonies. Unlike their counterparts in colonial Africa, the American black community has no indigenous institutions, with the possible exceptions of its religious organizations, and no general autonomous economy. Because that community is engulfed by the wider structure of society, by its occupations, its educational system, and so on, there exists amongst American black people a movement for integration as well as one for autonomy. And I did note, I put the MOBP, that there is no autonomous economy, that there is there there is no general autonomous economy. That's the whole point. So purveyors of the myth of buying power would argue, black purveyors of the myth would argue that black people need to uh, uh, act as if there is an autonomous black economy that black money can be recirculated in and used to evolve, but there is no such autonomous economy. I agree with that point. Um, but again, while I don't think it is mutually exclusive. And I think, again, for my students in my classes, I would want to make the point that, again, this is not to say that every black person is in the United States has the exact colonial experience of everybody on the African continent. It wouldn't even be to say that every continental African is colonized in the exact same form or fashion. It is to say that the ultimate goal is a colonial relationship where groups of people are held either in literal geographic distinction or certainly in social distinction. And I still do agree that black people are held at minimum in social distinction, even when physically they are allowed to exist next to their white folks, to their particular prescribed white colonial rulers. Uh, but because but one of the differences may also be that, yeah, but and this goes back to that other point about settler colonialism being distinct from colonialism. That if black people are at least in to some degree attempting to integrate as well as separately work for sovereignty and autonomy, that ultimate I guess that is ultimately for what Veracini would say is are movements designed to preserve one form of colonialism or another, either settler or traditional. But I don't. Yeah, maybe I don't know. I don't know. um, but anyway, I just think it's interesting to consider. So if because there's an attempt, there are both attempts to integrate and have been attempts for nationalist autonomy. That one is a defense of or in yeah, is advocating one persistent form of colonialism over another. The autonomous one would be you would be you have to make sure that neo-colonial bond is erased, as Veracini was pointing out. Otherwise, movements for national sovereignty just become colonial, as opposed to settler colonial or internally colonial. And again, this is similar to what is being said here by Hind, that when independence was gained, the legal equality proclaimed, the Indians were already placed in a position inferior to that of the rest of the population. That indigenous populations, in this case in the Central America, Um, and this is why, in this part, I think it's interesting to introduce to students. Just to say, look, you're not going to be tested on how well you understand or know this, but just to be introduced to the fact that these other parts of the world exist, that other parts of the world are having these kinds of conversations, and for me, importantly, that Black people have been part of these conversations and are part of these conversations of coloniality, very in whatever form. Um, but that without anyway, but the point being here that again, as I understood it, similar to the Veracini article, that Hind is saying that indigenous populations, even when there's an attempt to get independence, it's an argument for the permanent subjection as settler colonial, as defined as the settler colonial indigenous. When indigenous people say we want our autonomy and to be recognized as individual nations, but within this already existing settler colonial relationship, we're just advocating for the permanence of that settler colonial relationship, not an end to it. That's deep. I loved reading this article, and all of them actually, or reread, and prepare, in part because this level of confusion that I feel in this moment, and that I want my students to feel, is something that I encourage. I think it's good to have your concepts challenged, and to have to think about things differently, or renewed, or for the first time. Um, just quickly here, Israel is mentioned. Obviously, a study in internal colonialism has maintained that the social condition of Israeli Arabs is analogous to that of Amerindians and to that of Black people in South Africa. A lot of people have made that argument, and then I would just say it's just there are some questions raised about that here. I don't. Know that we need to what I would have just wanted to do in the spring, when my classes meet more regularly, I would want to have more discussions with them, and maybe I'll try to do this via Canvas for the winter session, but to get people to revisit what's going on in Palestine within this kind of context, within the context of considering colonization, and how those patterns of colonization or forms are parallel or the same or slightly different. Again, I don't think the distinctions between South Africa and Israel are important at the level of are only important at the level of really digging into the history and the specificity. I think the focus on the commonality is more important, and certainly for evolving a sort of an internationalist frame, it's very important. All right, theories of internal colonialism derive from analogies, and these theses based upon them. In theses based upon them, the colonizing and colonized sections of society live in the same country. They could also embrace some colonialisms or other they could also embrace some of colonialism's other characteristics, such as humanitarianism, So this is where I started. I was like, what is Hind really saying here? That's what I meant. That's why I have the multiple colors here. So, right, theories of internal colonialism derive from analogies. So people are constantly making comparisons from what's happening here to what's happening there. The theories normally include such characteristics of conventional colonialism is political subjection, economic exploitation, cultural domination, and racial conflict. They could also embrace some of colonialism's other characteristics, such as its humanitarianism and the beneficial effects of its desire to civilize and Christianize. These aspects of the phenomenon are usually ignored by protagonists of internal colonial theories. Yeah, because protagonists such as myself of these theories are not thinking of the humanitarianism of colonization and the desire to civilize or Christianize. I don't see those as good things. By the way, I should remind again, this Robert Hind article was referenced in one of the other ones that I read was it the New York Times one? I can't remember which one, but that's why I went and found the article again. I remembered the name, I recognized the name. I feel like when I was writing I Mix What I Like, I reviewed one of these, some of his work, maybe this very article, but But yes, I would want to reject. So what Hind is doing here is not overtly offering what he thinks of the theory or what should be used. He's offering, I think, a pretty useful overview of how internal colonialism has been conceived by a variety of different groups of people historically, and where some of the criticism comes in. I haven't, but to include this section here is wild. Uh, that anybody should consider the humanitarian or beneficial aspects of its desire to civilize. I don't ever think of colonialism or imperialism as legitimately being a desire to civilize and to Christianize. Those are euphemisms for take advantage of and exploit. Yes, there may be people involved individually who believe that that's what they're doing, but that's not, and I don't think any of that is good. I don't think Christianizing is good, and I don't think it's civilization as it's been imposed through imperialism is that, and or was necessary to evolve what we would want as a civilized humanity. But so um, the adaptability of the internal colonial concept, which has been related to states that once had empires and to those that were once colonies, to capitalist and to communist states, to entire political entities, as well as to some of their constituent parts, as in the case of Alaska and Quebec, is incontrovertible. So this is where now. So again, he had that little this little bad part here. This is a mess. But what I do like is this part. This point being made here. There's a variety of ways. There's an adaptability to the concept, so he acknowledges that there's some value to the approach, even as he ultimately seems to not agree with it. That he says, it gains in flexibility and adaptability. Its theoretical application does lose its. He says it's rigor, but um, and that's also been part of where I've of some of the criticism I've gotten around, and I remember there was one experience that I had where an article I was trying to code, yes. So it's interesting. So Saturday, I did a Saturday Night Live, and somebody asked me if I'm going to publish with Dr. Burroughs, and I had said that my memory that night was that we had only actually co-authored one article, which was the very first thing I think I ever published back in the day, in an article in favor of the concept of B-span or a black C-span. And we co-edited the Malcolm X book, but the only other thing that I didn't remember Saturday that we actually tried to co-author involved a section I was writing about how Mumia Abu Jamal had applied the concept of internal colonialism. And Eric King Watts III, who was the editor of the journal that we were submitting this to at the time, in a several backs and forth with me, would not publish the article. And one of his arguments was what is being made here. The internal colonialism theory is not being made. You are not convincingly. So it was largely around. I was not convincing enough that the theory was valid enough, and as Hind says here, that it was not intellectually rigorous enough, that there are too many differences in the experiences, that you can't just say black people aren't internal. And my point to King Watts was, I remember one of the points I was trying to make was, it doesn't matter if you or I think internal colonialism theory is a valid approach. It doesn't matter if you think it's rigorous enough. The point of this article is not to defend internal colonialism as a theoretical approach. It's to point out that Mumia, in his own work, applied it. He wouldn't publish the article. So I have experienced this myself, where people are saying that uh, um, uh, as I said here, it's an arguably artificial analogy, obscurantist and misleading. It has a certain superficiality. Um, it has an implicit idealization of pre-colonial societies. Internal colonial theories imply an improbable degree of cohesion and identity of interest among specific social groups, and they oversimplify complex social structures and relationships. Again, maybe this is why Taylor and others don't really rock with it. Most studies appear to be more concerned to demonstrate the validity of a particular analysis than to explore the rich potential of the internal colonial concept in its entirety. On the one hand, I don't agree with it being an arguably artificial analogy or superficial or idea, or I certainly don't agree that I or anyone else that I've read idealizes pre-colonial societies. They, if anything, are just making the point that colonizers don't get to say that pre-colonial societies were so backwards that they deserved all the colonization that they got. But I don't agree. But I do agree, certainly with my own work, that I and some of us have not fully explored the potential of the concept in its entirety. Um, but for me, again, it's more important to highlight the similarities in the application of forms of colonialism than to find all the specific differences. So maybe I can see I would be guilty of oversimplifying complex social structures and relationships, the interests of specific social groups. I don't know. Maybe in my own work I've been guilty of that, but I don't think the theory itself encourages that. In fact, you could make that claim about everybody else. So when people talk, when they talk about the beautiful pluralistic approach to American multicultural, they're doing the same thing. They're oversimplifying complex social structures and relationships. But anyway, but I like that this article at least addressed itself to some of that. So what's my note here? There's a lack of an adequate theory of imperialism. Now I thought this was an interesting point that similar to what Veracini says in his article about settler colonial studies, Hind here says that there needs to be a more robust study of imperialism because imperialism produces so much of the overarching structure for how people involved in internal colonialism theory approach the topic that um, that there needs to be more study of imperialism that would improve the quality of the work around internal colonialism. But I wrote here, this is precisely why I like internal colonialism theory, because it requires an adequate theory of imperialism. And that has always been my point that when you talk about Black America, when the traditional approach to Black history in the United States, yes, again, I don't want to, I'm aware that Black people here have had a very particular experience, but the traditional approach to that history ignores any connection to Black experience here, to the diaspora or other experiences, or to the broader scope of European imperialism. That, yes, what happened to Africans here is particular and specific, but it is part of a broader European imperial process that traditional approaches or mainstream approaches to American history and Black history don't encourage people to investigate. But the moment you say Black people are an internal colony or are internally colonized, you immediately, that was always been my point, that the US is called an empire all the time, but then discussed in the context of democracy. But empires don't produce democracies, they produce colonies. So that's what I've always liked about the approach that internal colonialism demands. What is colonialism? It is the process. It is an it is a subset of the imperial process of conquering another group of people. I only highlighted the name Philip Curtin because I remember reading Philip Curtin has a certain infamy in in Africana studies and African centered spaces as opposing or looking to impose a very Eurocentric view of African studies. But um, anyway, just thought that was an interesting reference there. So yeah, so he just argues that more study needs to be more needs to be done to study imperialism, then it will improve the subsequent studies of internal colonialism. Although the literature on dependency, like that on internal colonialism, raises as many problems as it answers, and although historians would probably find the evidence in the historical part rather thin, it has contributed to the formation of a consensus that the history of colonialism can only be meaningfully approached in the broader spectrum of underdevelopment and the specific problems of the third world. By the way, there's no reference to Rodney in this. He talks a little bit about development and underdevelopment, doesn't mention Rodney, which I thought was interesting, but you know. Um, Oh, here I have a thumbs down here. Since the attainment of independence, however, local ruling classes have frequently implemented policies that continued and perpetuated these characteristics and conditions. This has led to this to disputed proposition that the experience of Latin America, for example, has demonstrated that underdevelopment is not a decisive consequence of colonialism. Yeah, one of the points that he makes is that uh, basically that colonialism gets too much of a blame, and that that the current for the current state of affairs, that if you look at Latin America or the continent of Africa today, you couldn't put all the blame on their lack of development on colonialism. And I'm like, well, that's whack. That's why I had to put a whole thumbs down. I don't agree with that. And I don't think anything is done in this article to compellingly make that argument. Um, to be fair, Hind is only looking to give an overview of the criticisms and the arguments, so not to defend or explain them necessarily. So, but yeah, even if the concept is accepted, even if the validity of this concept is accepted, it will remain to a considerable extent a concept in search of a methodology, that is internal colonialism. It provides a means of approaching domestic historical problems from a particular perspective, one that leans heavily upon comparisons with the colonial experience, and one that draws upon alleged parallels between policies, attitudes, and developments that are discernible within a country as they are within a colony or within both a metropolitan power and its colonies. This dependence upon comparisons and parallels is not a source of methodological strength. And I wrote here in my notes, this would have been helped by an example of how this method is flawed, because they don't really do that. Because I don't see how is it a methodological flaw to compare what is happening to Black people here to other colonized communities. So I'd like to see how, and then to what extent would another approach be better? Because again, the preferred approach, the dominant approach, is this one that would have us kind of similar to what Hein was saying a moment ago, to say, look, Black people's problems, and this is where we get, with the whole financial literacy community and Black capitalist community. Hey, the underdevelopment of Black America has nothing to do with colonialism. It has to do with some other factors, some other something wrong with you. So I would have. On the other hand, scholars' distrust of internal colonial theory and their unwillingness to participate in its development have helped bring about this situation. So I like this part. So Hind is saying, look, critics of internal colonialism theory, your willingness to not participate and just hate on it have exacerbated the flaws and prevented maybe what could be valuable from emerging. And as I said earlier, well, there's good reason to resist internal colonialism as an approach, because again, it demands a whole other frame be applied to understanding what this country is and what to do about it. And it's also going to put you at odds with the world that would be inviting to Dyson and them. If internal colonial theories have come under suspicion in certain circles because of the influence of Marxist thought that is apparent in some of them, it should be noted that there were Europeans prior to the integrated articulation of socialist doctrines who expressed themselves in ways which suggest that they would not have found the internal colonial concept alien. So I like this point. Hind is saying to his colleagues, hey, if you're hating on internal colonialism because of its apparent relationship to Marxism and you're afraid of Marx, you got to be honest. Before Marx, before socialism, there were folks in Europe saying this theory is valid. And my approach to internal colonialism doesn't require the Marxist communist approach. It doesn't require any. It doesn't ignore them. It doesn't say it can't involve them. But you don't need Europe. You could stay strictly within the African world and find a long tradition of an understanding and approach of internal colonialism that is valuable. So even if even in the black world, if you want to avoid Marx and the Eurocentrism, you can do that. You don't need them uh, to reach the appropriate conclusion. Ulrich B. Phillips, another name I remember, another white black studies scholar that had to be corrected over time. Um, yeah, so as he says here, approaches inspired by the internal colonial concept might also assist historians and other social sciences who orient their work towards specific domestic issues or perceived problems. Like that's sort of my point too, that there's value in the concept in helping understand what's going on here. The internal colonial concept might also have seminal value for scholars who are attracted to the comparative study of society and history, the treatment of certain metropolitan societies or the experience of certain sections of metropolitan society and that of their colonial counterparts in a comparative way and within an internal colonial framework might help to identify features of their respective experiences that could pass undetected or be given insufficient emphasis or be misinterpreted if they were studied separately by other means. That's been my whole point. My own approach to it has always been saying if people have been studying the black experience in a variety of ways for a long time and I think a lot of the popular uh, approaches and conclusions reached by those approaches are insufficient. Part of my own way of attempting to write about this, admittedly I didn't do it well, was to say, look, all of these people, if you read all of these people talking about the black experience, they're identifying the colonialism black people suffer. They just don't use the language. So I'm saying take all that data, take all that analysis, put it within the analytical frame of internal colonialism that returns black people back to the appropriate world stage of history that within the context of European imperialism, and then opens up the whole panoply of responses that are discouraged to black people by more conventional approaches.